يا رايحين على مصر مين يبعت سلامي في كلمتين يا هلا الله مشتاق لناسها الطيبين ودي ياما فيها مخلصين يا ما شاء الله وفي أزهر العلماء تقدر تقول ما تشاء ده أنا والله بدعي لهم رب السما وقولوا امين ان شاء الله ان شاء الله. الله الله يا ربي الله الله ومن قلبي كده من الها صلى الفجر ولف في مصر وحواليها الله الله على الازهر الله 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 اكبر الدنيا كمان واكتر لو قلت اوصفها انا مش حنصفها وكفيها.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله سيد الأنبياء وخاتم المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. In the name of Allah, the gracious, the merciful, to Him we belong and to Him we shall return. We ask Allah Azza wa Jal in His infinite wisdom and in His infinite mercy to send peace and blessings upon our beloved Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us beneficial knowledge, and we seek refuge in Allah Azza wa Jal from knowledge that does not benefit. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to purify our intentions, and we ask Allah Azza wa Jal to have mercy upon our parents, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to remove the hardships from upon our brothers and sisters wherever they may be. Inshallah, today we will be continuing with our lessons in Usul al-Fiqh, the explanation of the work of Imam al-Juwayni Al-waraqat, and we are at the section of the book of Naskh, abrogation. And before I actually just get into the topic, for a lot of us who are studying and learning, and we hear constantly people discussing issues and matters of Islam, issues regarding Naskh, and some of the issues of Usul al-Fiqh, primarily amongst them issues Naskh, abrogation, ijma', scholarly consensus, are subject matters or topics that have a level of public debate, and people have been casting doubts into some of the usul and saying that there's no such thing as this, and this actually never happened, ulama just talk about it but it never actually took place, and so on and so forth. And so what's important to understand in our pursuit of knowledge and understanding of the deen is that, as Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali in his work Ihya Ulum al-Din says, that the student of knowledge, as he or she is learning, should never concern themselves with the issues that have differences of opinion on them. Okay? Major difference of opinion. It's acceptable to be aware, but if a student who's still learning concerns themselves with such a big topic like, is there such a thing as naskh or not? Right? Whereas, for example, we know that throughout our history that the overwhelming majority of ulama have said that there is such a thing as abrogation, that naskh exists, right? And that there are a handful of scholars who've said otherwise. Now, there is no doubt a lot of discussion surrounding this issue today. But for our sake, as students, what we should do is, first and foremost, understand what understand what the ulama did. The very least that we can do is recognize that we have this history, we have this tradition, we have ulama that spent centuries, tirelessly studying, putting these works in place, and doing this, all of this, for the sake of the ummah. And then we suddenly come today and decide, well, I can overlook all of these years of scholarship, and I can come and decide that, no, this is not the case. At the very least, I should respect history, let alone respecting our ulama. I should respect history, and I should respect that people actually did something. And so the best thing that I can do for myself as a student is first learn what happened. Learn what these ulama did. Spend time studying. Okay, this is a book that was written by Imam al-Juwayni, as we introduced this book, a very famous book, a very well-known book, a very well-known scholar. This book has been taught across the Muslim world. It has been explained dozens of times. It has been handled by hundreds and hundreds of ulama, okay? It has been on the curriculum of all the major Islamic institutions. Then that means maybe I should give this book a look. I should actually read this book and see maybe there's something beneficial here. And then I should see what else did the ulama study and read, and what else did they teach. And there are books like Jam' al-Jawami', Imam al-Sukki, and then you have Minhaj al-Baydawi, and then you have books like Al-Mahsul al-Imam al-Razi, and you have books like Al-Mustasfa al-Imam al-Ghazali, and Burhan al-Imam al-Juwayni, and Mukhtasar ibn al-Hajib, and the list goes on. So before I decide that naskh is a yes or a no, let me go and actually live with these ulama and understand what they said. It's very similar to me coming and saying, you know what, people like Einstein and I don't care, theory of relativity equals mc squared, I don't care, it doesn't matter. No, I'm gonna come and at least let me spend some time, learn what did he say and why did he say what he said, and then after all of that I can begin to possibly consider if I know something or not, or if I can actually say something in the contrary. And Imam al-Ghazali, the reason why he says that the student of knowledge in his beginning path should not concern himself with all of the major khilafat, it's because if you do, then it will cause a level of tashtit al-dhihn. Then my mind will go all over the place and I'll be in disarray and I'll be very confused because I have no foundation. And he gives a very beautiful example for this. He says that if I take a big bucket or a big barrel of impurities and I throw it into the ocean, what will happen? The ocean will absorb it. It will not affect the ocean. But if I take that same barrel of impurities and I put it into a bucket, it will definitely make it impure. So he says that is similar to the scholar and the student. The scholar can handle difference of opinion, can really hear them and absorb them. Why? Because he's dealt with the sciences, he's gone through the work, he's gone through everything to really be able to absorb it. But the student, on the other hand, cannot do that. The student, if he hears difference of opinion, becomes mushattat, confused, and just starts doubting everything. So rather than confusing oneself, try to spend time studying and learning what the ulama said. After you've mastered what they've said, then you can begin to go into the various inquiries that exist today. So that's just a small introduction before I get into naskh that I wanted to share. So our whole intention is to learn what the ulama have said regarding this subject matter, and to just begin to develop that process. So Imam al-Juwayni, rahimahullah, ونفعنا الله بعلمه في الدارين آمين, says, وأما النسخ فمعناه لغة, linguistically. So he says, with regards to abrogation, the linguistic meaning is al-izala, to remove or to cause to pass away. يقال, it is said, نسخت الشمس الظل, the sun erased the dhil, the shade. Okay? So the sun has abrogated the shade, meaning that the sun came and erased, removed the shade. وَقِيلَ مَعْنَاهُ النَّقْلُ, and it is said that it means to transfer or to copy. مِنْ قَوْلِهِمْ, from their saying, نَسَخْتُ مَا فِي الْكِتَابِ, I copied what is in the book. So if I have this book and I have a piece of paper and I begin to copy, I'm not actually erasing this, I'm simply copying it. It is said that that is another definition of naskh. إِذَا نَقَلْتُهُ بِأَشْكَالِ كِتَابَاتِهِ. So I'm just simply copying what is in this book to this piece of paper. So I'm not going to get into the linguistic definition. The ulama actually speak about this extensively. Does it actually mean this, or does it actually mean that? Is it haqiqatan in this? Is it, when we hear the word naskh, linguistically speaking, is it a reality in, for example, that it means to erase, and majazan, it is, not haqiqatan means that it is to do this transferring or copying. And there's a long discussion that for our sake is not important, but these are two definitions, and the Jumhur, without a doubt, are in the opinion that it means to erase, lughatan, linguistically. Shar'an, from a technical perspective, الخطاب الدال على رفع الحكم الثابت بالخطاب المتقدم على وجه لولاه لكان ثابتا. He says that from a technical perspective, it is defined as speech that indicates the removal of a hukm, the removal of a ruling or of a value established by a previous speech. Okay? So we have الخطاب الدال على رفع الحكم. So speech that indicates the removal, رفع الحكم الثابت بالخطاب المتقدم, that has been what? Established by previous speech. على وجه لولاه لكان ثابتا. Right? So it was established with this previous speech. This rule was established by this previous speech. If it wasn't for this speech, then it would have stayed, right? So, it is defined as speech that indicates the removal of a ruling established by a previous speech in such a way that without the second speech, the ruling of the first speech would remain. Okay, so you have one speech, and you have a second speech. This second speech is what is removing the ruling of the first speech. Okay? مع تراخيه عنه. And he says there must be a delay, so that the second speech comes after the first speech. Right? Because and each one of these of clauses that he places in definition insinuate a very specific thing. So I'm not going to go into all of the explanation of Imam al-Mahalli, but it's important that we touch upon a few things that he mentions. So he says that when he says that الخطاب الدال على رفع الحكم الثابت بالخطاب الثاني. So if we have one khitab that a second one comes and erases it, that is naskh, that is abrogation. But for example, if you have what we have in usul is something called al-bara'atu al-asliya, meaning that every single person in his origin his conscience is free, there are no obligations, and then an obligation can come, and now your dhimma mu'allaqa bihukm. Now your conscience actually you are responsible for doing something. Okay? So when you initially had no obligations, fi bara'atu dhimma, there was no obligations, and then an obligation came. What does that mean? That means that you simply have a new obligation. That's not abrogation. That's just a new obligation. Okay? So that's one thing that he points out. Another thing that he says is that the the removal of the first hukm has to happen by a second hukm, because there can be a removal of ahkam in ways other than speech. A second hukm, for example, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes the soul of someone, the hukm is removed. Khalas, does this person actually have to do something. And other ways, junoon, if a person goes crazy, the hukm is removed, right? The ruling is removed. So that's another important. That's another important clause that he mentions to explain what this specific definition will entail. That this specific definition entails one speech, a second speech. This second speech is removing the ruling from the first speech, and that this second speech comes after the first speech. So another thing that he mentions or he points out is the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sometimes says something, and then he comes and he points out that this speech ends at a certain point. It's not actually abrogation. So an example that he brings is إذا نودي للصلاة من يوم الجمعة فاسعوا إلى ذكر الله وذروا البيع. If you are called to prayer on Friday, then go to the remembrance of Allah and stay away from selling. So this hukm is telling us, this ayah is telling us what? That during the Friday prayer, there is no selling. Okay? In another verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِذَا قُضِيَتِ الصَّلَاةُ فَانْتَشِرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَابْتَغُوا مِنْ فَضْلِ اللَّهِ. If salah finishes, if prayer ends, then go out into the earth and seek from the bounty and the goodness of Allah Azza wa Jal. Now, this second verse, some people may think that it is abrogating the first verse, but it actually is not. What it is doing is simply pointing out that as soon as the first verse ends, which is that point of the end of prayer, when prayer ends, you're allowed to now continue your selling. So up until prayer, you are not allowed to sell. After prayer, you're allowed to sell. So it's just pointing at the fact that things are starting and beginning. But this second verse did not remove the ruling of the first verse. Another example, وَحُرِّمَ عَلَيْكُمْ صَيْدُ الْبَرِّ مَا دُمْتُمْ حُرُمْ. As long as you are in a state of ihram during the Hajj season and so on, then you are not allowed to hunt. وَإِذَا حَلَلْتُمْ فَاصْطَادُوا. But if you are now exited that state of ritual purity, of ihlal, then now you can hunt. So there's no abrogation. It's not as if the second verse came and abrogated the first verse. It's simply telling you at this point you can now move on here. Okay? So and then Imam al-Juwayni says, وَيَجُوزُ نَسْخُ الرَّسْمِ وَبَقَاءُ الْحُكْمِ. He says that a text can be abrogated while the ruling remains. So we have نسخ الرسم وبقاء الحكم. The rasm, the actual text, the letters, let's say, has been removed, but the ruling stays. The most popular and famous definition that is offered in the books of usul is الشيخ والشيخة إذا زنيا فرجموهما البتة. Right? And this in Sayyidina Umar, this exists in Muwatta Malik and other books of hadith, where Sayyidina Umar says that this verse existed, right? And we used to recite this verse, and then it was abrogated, it was removed, but the hukm, the ruling, remains. And so this is, I don't think I defined it, but this is basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling us that there is such a thing as stoning. فَارْجُمُوهُمَ الْبَتَّةِ. If a woman who is married and a man who is married, right, if they had illicit affairs, then you stone them. Okay? What we have here is that this actual verse has been removed from the Quran. Right? It was abrogated. But the ruling remained. The ruling being what? Stoning. Right? Once again, this is one of these issues that are very famous, have a lot of controversy around them. And for our sake, we're not talking about the ethical implications or any moral attachments or anything along those lines. We can discuss that, but in a different setting. For our case, we're simply trying to understand the ulama of usul and how they dealt with the Quran and Sunnah, and how they sought to understand the Quran and Sunnah to deduce legal rulings. Okay? So, with regards to abrogation, Imam al-Juwayni is telling us يجوز النسخ نسخ الرسم وبقاء الحكم, that the text can be abrogated but the ruling can remain. Another form of abrogation, وَنَسْخُ الْحُكْمِ وَبَقَاءُ الرَّسْمِ, that the ruling can be abrogated but the text remains. The example that Imam al-Mahalli brings, وَالَّذِينَ يُتَوَفَّوْنَ مِنْكُمْ وَيَذَرُونَ أَزْوَاجًا وَصِيَّةً لِأَزْوَاجِهِمْ مَتَاعًا إِلَى الْحَوْلِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, basically, that when a man dies, a woman should wait 1 year before remarrying. Okay, this is the verse. Another verse comes and says, وَالَّذِينَ يُتَوَفَّوْنَ مِنْكُمْ وَيَذَرُونَ أَزْوَاجًا يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ أربعة أشهر وعشرة, that if a man dies, a woman should wait 4 months. So here clearly, the second verse abrogated the first verse. Okay? But both texts remain. both texts, we read them in the Quran. نتعبد بتلاوتهما. We worship Allah Azza wa Jal with the recitation of both texts. But the ruling of the second one removed the ruling of the first one. And then Imam al-Juwayni says, وَنَسْخُ الْأَمْرَيْنِ مَعًا. And that it is possible that one of the forms of abrogation is that both the text and the ruling are removed. And he brings the example of Hadith Aisha, كان فيما أنزل عشر وضعات معلومات يحرم. Basically, that Sayyidah Aisha is saying that it used to be that 10 suckles, if a child suckled a woman, a mother 10 times, then she would become his mother through rida'a, through breastfeeding. Sayyidah Aisha says that they were abrogated بِخَمْسٍ مَعْلُومَاتٍ يُحَرِّمْ, meaning that when it used to be 10, it became 5. Rather than 10 suckles, it became 5 suckles. What this hadith is indicating that there used to be a text and a ruling that said 10 suckles. And then it was both the text and the ruling were abrogated by what? By a new text and rule that said 5. Okay, so in this case, both the text and the ruling were removed. Then he says, وَيَنْقَسِمُ النَّسْخُ إِلَى بَدَلٍ وَإِلَى غَيْرِ بَدَلٍ. Then he says that some abrogation substitutes a new requirement for the old one. So rather than there being a removal, there is a substitution. Okay? وَيَنْقَسِمُ النَّسْخُ إِلَى وَيَنْقَسِمُ. Then he says that there is naskh through substitution. So we used to have to face towards what? Baytul Maqdis. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala substituted for Baytul Maqdis the Kaaba. And then he says that وَإِلَى مَا هُوَ أَغْلَظ, that there can be a naskh rather than substitution, there can be a naskh to what is harder. So something was easier, then it became harder. For example, in the stages of Siyam, we used to be offered the opportunity either to fast or to pay fidya. We used to have the option back in the process of making Siyam fard. One of the second stage, al-marhala thaniya, was that you either had the option to fast or pay something. That was abrogated by what? By only being allowed to fast. So that means that the abrogation went from easier to harder, because having the option to do this or that is easier than having to only fast. Okay? And then he says, وَإِلَى مَا هُوَ أَخَفْ. You can also have abrogation from what is difficult to easier. For example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran says, وَإِن يَكُن مِّنكُمْ 20 صَابِرُونَ يَغْلِبُ 200. That you can have 20 patient people who will be victorious over 200. So that means that to be victorious, one person has to be patient in front of 10, because 20 in front of 200 means that every one person has to be patient in front of 10 people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then later on says another verse, فَإِن يَكُن مِّنكُم 100 صَابِرَةٌ يَغْلِبُ 200. That 100 of you being patient will be victorious over 200, meaning that the ratio is 1 to 2. So as in the previous verse the ratio was 1 to 10, that for you to be victorious, every one of you would have to be patient in front of 10. Now every one of you has to be impatient in front of what? 2. So that means that it became easier. So it went from, the abrogation happened from being difficult to easier. Then Imam al-Juwayni says, وَيَجُوزُ نَسْخُ الْكِتَابِ بِالْكِتَابِ. So now he's saying that that naskh, you have different forms of naskh. either you either have the first one being naskhul kitabi bil kitab, that the book, the Quran, abrogates the Quran. All right, and we gave the example of the iddah, of the woman who her husband died. It used to be 1 year, then it went to 4 months. So that the Quran abrogated the Quran. وَنَسْخُ السُنَّةِ بِالْكِتَابِ. And you can, then he says that you have the abrogation of the Sunnah by the Kitab. So the Sunnah is abrogated by the Quran. And the example of that is the naskh that took place from when we went from Baytul Maqdis, rather than facing Baytul Maqdis, we start facing what? The Kaaba. That the hadith came with the action of the Prophet ﷺ facing Baytul Maqdis. That means that it thabata bis sunnah, that we used to face the Masjid al-Aqsa. But then the Quran came and said, فَوَلِّ وَجْهَكَ شَطْرَ الْمَسْجِدِ الْحَرَامِ, face the Kaaba. So this verse of the Quran what came to us through the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, which was facing Baytul Maqdis. And so Imam al-Mahali brings various other examples, but I think that one example is enough, inshallah. And then he finishes off by saying, وَيَجُوزُ نَسْخُ الْمُتَوَاتِرِ بِالْمُتَوَاتِرِ. And it is allowed that the mutawatir, that reports that come en masse, okay, or mass reports, can abrogate mass reports. All right? Is that clear? So you have mutawatir abrogates mutawatir. Mass reports abrogate mass reports. وَنَسْخُ الْآحَادِ بِالْآحَادِ وَبِالْمُتَوَاتِرِ. And that singular reports or non-mass reports can be abrogated by singular or non-mass reports and mass reports. All right? وَلَا يَجُوزُ نَسْخُ الْمُتَوَاتِرِ بِالْآحَادِ. And then he says it is not allowed, or it is impermissible, or is not allowed that the mutawatir is that it is abrogated by the ahad. Now, this last point that he mentions, there is definitely a disagreement about this between the ulama. And actually, the majority opinion is that it is allowed. The majority opinion is that an ahad report can do naskh of a mutawatir report. Ahad? Ahad means singular, not mass. An example, for example, of ahad, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. These are all ahad reports, right? A specific example regarding this issue, I don't have one on my mind right now, but for our sake, it is just important to understand that singular reports, according to the jumhur, the majority of scholars, can abrogate mass reports, mutawatir reports. And this is not in Imam al-Juwayni adopts the opinion that this cannot be the case. And there is reasoning that is given. The ulama say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, مَا نَنْسَخْ مِنْ آيَةٍ أَوْ نُنْسِهَا نَأْتِ بِخَيْرٍ مِنْهَا أَوْ مِثْلِهَا, right? And so what these ulama say is that ahad is lesser than mutawatir. A singular report is lower than a mutawatir report. This is their reasoning, because the ayah says what? When we abrogate, we bring something that is better or equal. The other ulama say that no, there's a long discussion for what they say, but basically what they say is that we're not abrogating singular, and singular is not abrogating mutawatir. What's happening is that the abrogation that is happening is the rule of the mutawatir, and the rule of the mutawatir itself is dhanni, is indefinitive. And so in that case, an ahad, which is dhanni, can abrogate another dhanni entity, which is the ruling of the mutawatir. Is that clear? Should I repeat it one more time? Okay. So the first camp, Imam al-Juwayni says, they say, what they said is clear. that a dhanni, or I'm sorry, yes, ahad is lesser than a mutawatir. Ahad being singular, mutawatir being a mass report. That this is clearly lesser. And the Quran said clearly that we will abrogate it by something better or equal. And so their logic is that there is no way that this ahad is better than the mutawatir. That's one logic. That is the argument of Imam al-Juwayni and others. Other ulama come and say no, and this is the jumhur opinion, this is the majority of scholars. They say no, that it is allowed that the mutawatir does naskh of the ahad does naskh of the mutawatir. And the argument that they make is this, that what this ahad is actually abrogating is not the mutawatir itself. What it is abrogating is the hukm, the ruling of that mutawatir. And the ruling of the mutawatir is what? Is dhanni. Not every mutawatir that we have is qat'i, is definitive. You can have a mutawatir that comes to us en masse, but the actual nas is dhanni. It's indefinitive. I don't clearly know what's being said. So it can be mutawatir, but the nas itself can be dhanni. So the ruling can be dhanni, can be indefinitive. So what these ulama are saying is that the ahad, which is dhanni, which is indefinitive, can abrogate the hukm of the mutawatir, which is what? Also indefinitive. Okay? Is that clear? Inshallah, I hope it's clear. But it's a little bit, this is definitely way above this text, but you know, I just wanted to share that. Hopefully it's clear. So nonetheless, this is the end of Babun Naskh, and inshallah we will stop there. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive our shortcomings. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive any mistakes that were made in dealing with this work and this text. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to remove the hardships from upon us. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.
الله الله يا ربي الله الله ومن قلبي علي توضى كده مني الها صلى الفجر ولف في مصر وحواليها الله الله على الأزهر الله 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 أكبر الدنيا كمان واكتر لو قلت اوصفها أنا مش هنصفها وكفيها الله الله